So what I'm going to present this evening is a part of that book project that I'm working on over the next year, and it's this presentation tonight will deal with Documenta 13, which happened last summer. And I think if you weren't able to visit the exhibition, I think that will be okay. I'm going to show a lot of images and discuss it, so you'll get an introduction to it. So I'm really curious, as you'll see, in the way the exhibition dealt with ecology and things natural. So that's my focus. Even though the exhibition was enormous, and there's so many different angles that one could approach it through, I'm really focusing on this ecological dimension, as you'll see. So, according to Carolyn Christoph-Bukarjiev, the director of Documenta 13, we live in a state of permanent crisis, a state of emergency, and thus of exception. So that's what she wrote in her letter to a friend, which introduced her thinking about the exhibition. As such, it may seem surprising that she chose to respond to that state of crisis with numerous gardens in what is undoubtedly the most ambitious of mega exhibitions. Nonetheless, the show was overgrown with experimental planters and creatively landscaped areas, relating variously to agriculture, farming, and natural life forms, which made the 2012 iteration of Documenta that occurs every 5 years in central Germany, the most eco yet. The garden as art included Christina Buch's The Lover, and you see a still of that here. And here's another view of it, which was an open-air butterfly microhabitat installed in front of Kassel's Staatstheater, comprised of plants ideal for indigenous varieties of the insect, some of which emerged from their chrysalises during the length of the show. Also, Christian Philipp Müller's Swiss chard ferry, a group of barges floating on one of the canals in the Karlsaue Park, filled with different edible varieties, realized in cooperation with the Department of Organic Agricultural Sciences at the University of Kassel in Witzenhausen. And there was Song Dong's Doing Nothing Garden, a 6-meter-high accumulation of rubble and organic refuse, sprouting grass and flowers and sporting neon signs reading Doing Nothing in Chinese, in Mandarin, found on the Karlswiese lawn in front of the orangerie. Gardens may seem irrelevant to our world of ecological crisis and emergencies, the specific circumstances of which Christoph Bukarjiev neglected to identify. But, in fact, they concern the most urgent of global conflicts, including the corporate financialization of nature, realized by the patenting of genetically modified seeds by agriculture and pharmaceutical corporations, the production of greenhouse gas emissions via monoculture and export-based agribusiness reliant on the fossil fuel transportation industry, and the use of chemical fertilizers, and the destruction of unions and small-scale farmers displaced by the mechanization and monopoly ownership of the means of production by large-scale agribusinesses. About these pressing emergencies, the curators, including the director's so-called core agent, Chus Martinez, had little to say. And as such, the very various biotic artworks risked becoming mere green embellishments to an already organically adorned Baroque environment, especially given the Karlsaue's Park's 18th century redesign as a landscape garden. So, for example, Clara Pentecost's vertical gardens adorned the Athenaeum's front grounds, rendering her 8-foot-high dirt and plant towers extensions of the Natural History Museum's landscaped grounds, and suggesting an organic approach to sculptural decoration. Yet far from evident was the radical nature of Pentecost's proposals, meant as prototypes for self-sufficient food production in land-poor urban areas. That is, unless one dutifully read the exhibition's guidebook or was already familiar with the artist's politico-ecological activities. And I should point out that Claire Pentecost will be a guest in London at the Whitechapel. I think that's next month. I think she has one or two speaking engagements and will participate in the upcoming show at Whitechapel. Described as an exhibition without a concept by the director in the run-up to the show, in order to de-instrumentalize and singularize the inclusions, Documenta 13 largely outsourced the definition of the show's conceptualization to impossibly multiple and sometimes internally conflicted 100 notebooks, publications, and here you see a range of them. While that overwhelming panoply provided little immediate service to visitors at the exhibition, the publications do open up fertile territory for considerations of certain pressing environmental matters when one has the time to read them. The series assembles short essays by a range of artists and theorists, including some of the ecological, such as Donna Harraway, which suggest numerous productive, if competing, ways to approach the exhibition's gardens, and more broadly, its approach to the environment. So I'd like to talk about a couple of those Documenta notebooks in a little bit more detail. Let's start with Donna Harraway's notebook, which was entitled SF, Speculative Fabulation and String Figures, which rehearses the terms of an aesthetic of techno-organic hybridity, familiar in Harraway's well-known work on cyborgs, which finds a creative political inspiration in the science of gene research and bioengineering. SF for Harraway stands for a number of things, such as speculative fabulation, speculative feminism, science fiction, science fact, and science fantasy, each exemplifying the social reality, each exemplifying the joining of otherwise conventional oppositions that her cyborg also signifies as a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction, in Harraway's words. In other words, one that models and thus stimulates a world beyond the oppressive binaries of Western modernity, such as male, female, culture, nature, technology, biology, and so on. So she's very interested in breaking down these boundaries, these oppositions, these binaries. Harraway's conceptual presence was discernible in the exhibition's spatial dispersion, with its dozens of off-site locations comprising a rhizomatic display geography, and in its conceptual diffusion, where 100 approaches eclipsed any single recurring theme. It was also perceptible in the nature culture, those two words put together to make one neologism, nature culture, and the intra-actional aspects of the becoming with ontology of the gardens, suggesting environments that play a role in both organizing and providing socio-aesthetic support systems for human life. Yet mobilizing Harraway as a model for eco-aesthetics today is a tricky maneuver, especially when placed in relation to the many political garden practices at Documenta 13, such as that of Irene Anastas and René Gabri, and their collective and, which embraced an explicitly, quote, anti-capitalist, organic and localist character, and whose garden kiosks sold regional food and produce on the exhibition grounds. So if you visited the exhibition, you would come across these kiosks where you could buy something to eat that was produced organically from the region. And it wasn't expensive, but the selections were often quite sparse. When I was there, I bought a cucumber to eat. They didn't really have much in the kiosk at that time, but it was a very good cucumber. The artist-run initiative and, which formed part of Documenta 13, they were one of the director's agents that collaborated on the formation of the show. So and investigated the notions of the commons and non-capitalist life in gatherings and seminars across the world in the 2 years in preparation for the exhibition. And they participated in and organized events like the U.S. Social Forum in Detroit, Michigan, and workshops in Tunis, in Yerevan, in Buenos Aires, and many other places. And the group also organized events over the show's 100 days. And one of these events included Event 13, when the group, in alliance with the Compass of the Midwest Radical Culture Corridor, placed the Monsanto Corporation on trial for ecological and economic crimes. And that took place in Carbondale, in Chicago, Illinois, and Iowa City in January of 2012. So this is the poster that announced the Monsanto hearings. And Monsanto, I'm sure you're aware of this, but Monsanto is one of the major businesses that has patented seeds and has had an incredibly destructive effect on farming worldwide, including inventing the so-called suicide seed that destroys itself after a year. So you can't save the seeds and they won't reproduce. And this has held farmers hostage to purchasing seeds from Monsanto on a yearly basis. The political ecology implied here in this example of and, is perhaps best articulated not by Harraway, but by the Indian eco-activist Vandana Shiva, another of the exhibition's notebook authors. Known for her struggle against the patenting of indigenous knowledge of seeds and plant life by multinational pharmaceutical and agribusiness corporations. While Harraway too explicitly opposes the patenting of life forms, and she said so explicitly, her postmodern aesthetic and ecofeminist science fiction ultimately crosses Shiva's anti-corporate globalization climate justice activism, leading to a conflict of global ecological visions, and that's what I'm really interested in. For Shiva, who wrote a notebook also, but was much less playful than Harraway's, her notebook was entitled The Corporate Control of Life. She writes, living organisms, unlike machines, organize themselves and cannot be treated as simply biotechnological inventions or gene constructs or products of the mind. Those are all terms that corporations use to justify the patenting of life forms as intellectual products. So against what she calls corporate biopiracy, Shiva places her emphasis on the fight to protect the legal sovereignty of non-commercialized knowledge systems and the free and universal access to the life processes that comprise humanity's shared heritage. Harraway's cyborg, conversely, and quote, does not dream of community on the model of the organic family and would not recognize the Garden of Eden, as he or she is wary of holism but needy for connection. And that's from her book, Simians, Cyborgs, and Women. For Harraway, the lively area of transgenic research worldwide becomes a source of inspiration and gives rise to such hybrids as, and this is again Harraway writing, hybrids such as the tomato with a gene from the cold sea bottom living flounder, which codes for a protein that slows freezing, and the potato with a gene from the giant silk moth, which increases disease resistance. So these genetically modified organisms inspire visions of new forms of emancipation for Harraway, beyond the essentialist identities and cultural ontological purities that she finds so problematic. Harraway, moreover, acknowledges being suspicious of activist positions that oppose corporate science with the values of the local and the organic. She writes, I cannot help but hear in the biotechnological debates the unintended tones of fear of the alien and suspicion of the mixed. In the appeal to intrinsic natures, I hear a mystification of a kind and purity akin to the doctrines of white racial hegemony and U.S. national integrity and purpose. So that's Harraway writing. That's from her book called Modest Witness. So in other words, she's comparing activists who are protesting against GM biotechnology. She's comparing them to white supremacists, as if they're, attempting to return to this rhetoric of purity and organic unities that she finds so potentially racist. So that's an extraordinary claim, I think, even though she does go on to qualify this. But I'm really interested in how Harraway, as someone who's very progressive in many different areas, can have this type of relation to GM technology. Yet, with Shiva's politics in mind, one cannot help but hear in Harraway's enthusiasm for GMOs a questionable aesthetico-political imagination that unintentionally corresponds with corporate practices like Monsanto's, with its global threat to the livelihood of farmers, indigenous eco-knowledge, and human health itself. There was thus a profound divergence within Documenta 13's discursive positioning of its gardens between Harraway's postmodern constructivist approach to biotechnological hybridity as a model of creative liberation, on the one hand, and Shiva's post-colonial commitment to an ecological justice opposed to corporate property claims on organic resources pilfered from the third world, on the other. While Documenta 13 productively raised this very conundrum, or this conflict, by its inclusion of these different voices, the clash of positions, which concerns pressing global conflicts over food production, capitalism, and the status of the natural world, was never explicitly engaged in the exhibition's framework, only by individual authors and artists. So this is my main problem with the exhibition. As a result, Christoph Bukhardziev's project, her Documenta 13, risked a non-position of uncommitted pluralism, a tendency that is, of course, familiar in the liberal milieu of contemporary art, happy to allude to crises and emergencies, but take no clear stand in relation to them. To take a position would demand a critique of the contradictions, for example, in sci-fi aesthetics, of the kind that Harraway supports, and to position them in relation to their political ecologies of the kind Shiva points to, and to in terms of her critique of sci-fi, in terms of this critique of sci-fi aesthetics, for me, I found the work of Frederick Jameson in his book Archaeologies of the Future of particular usefulness, which looks at sci-fi utopian literature and analyzes its political conditions, although he doesn't touch so much on ecology, despite dealing with books such as Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy of the 1990s, that we could hold accountable for a positive, even utopian take on GM biotechnology, used in relation, in the case of the Mars trilogy, to the terraforming of that planet in the imagined near future. I think a counter to Kim Stanley Robinson might be something like Margaret Atwood and Oryx and Crake, or her recent book, The Year of the Flood, that shows the dystopia of a future dominated by GM technology and the kind of experimentation that's going on today. But that's another matter. So how do futurist imaginings of corporate biotech experimentation correlate with current-day political conflicts over land use, energy resources, and GM technology? And what's the political unconscious implied in the aesthetics of genetic hybridity? So these are questions that I think we need to think about and ask. In fact, Documenta 13 also included numerous artistic visions of potential dystopian futures, and I'm going to turn to those now, such as the film and installation project News from Nowhere of 2012 by the South Korean artists Moon Kyung-wang and Jun Jun-ho. We can consider their project should alternatives not save us from the current course of corporate globalization's environmental auto-destruction. An example of sci-fi aesthetics, the multimedia project comprises a film, installation, and a book publication, and builds on a scientific iconography of genetic engineering and biotechnology that resonates in some ways with Harraway's cyborg poetic eco-futurism. In this regard, it reveals further ways to consider the relations between science, nature, and advanced capitalism in contemporary art. So this is a still from the installation at Documenta 13. Inspired by the eponymous 1890 story of a future agrarian worker society by the socialist artist William Morris, Moon and Jun's presentation, News from Nowhere, visualizes a post-apocalyptic time to come when humanity, owing to a series of catastrophic major climate changes, is reduced to an endangered species, and survivors are left to reconsider their philosophies of life that now lie in ruins. Referring to utopian socialism and science fiction, the film, The End of the World, portrays a late 21st century Earth permeated with radioactivity and hazardous waste, where raised sea levels necessitate floating settlements, and the corporate giant Tempers, that's their imagined corporation, rules over all. Those seeking citizenship, including the film's male and female protagonists, volunteer to collect samples in the surrounding toxic environment, without realizing their real mission is to serve as living research specimens exposed to atmospheric contamination. The accompanying archival installation that's called Voice of Metanoia assembles an array of futuristic products. And here you see some of them, such as clothes and tools that, created collaboratively with other artists, designers, and architects today in South Korea, are presented as if they come from the film's fictional corporation from the future. And I have a clip I can show you. This is taken from online, so it shows you an installation context of the film, but gives you a sense of, at least, of the film. So the project makes apparent a further risk of Harraway's model. In this case, a sci-fi poetics that aestheticizes crisis but establishes no real political traction. Much like the speculative fabulation of pop cultural variants, like the various films that we could think of from Star Trek to Avatar, the piece sidesteps critical knowledge about the present, opting instead for visual gratifications of our desire for futurist fantasy. Indeed, it pays mere lip service to the failures of the present without identifying the causes of or providing alternatives to the so-called major climate changes that serve as its fiction's generic foundation. Seduced by futuristic style, a corporate scientific social order, technological redemption, and the imagery of a transfigured post-human cyborg body, the film and installation construct a problematic utopian imaginary within our otherwise catastrophic circumstances. A counter-model in Documenta 13, in my view, is offered by the Otolith Group's film The Radiant, also 2012, which exchanges Moon and Jun's dystopian futurism for a focus on the real existing corporate science complex and its disastrous failure that is itself worthy of fiction. The approximately 1 hour film takes March 11, 2011 as its point of departure, when the Tohoku earthquake occurred off the Pacific coast of Japan, triggering a tsunami that left more than 15,000 people dead and caused a catastrophic nuclear meltdown at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, which continues to contaminate land, air, and maritime environments to this day. Mixing appropriated, and these are a couple stills from the film, here's some more, mixing appropriated historical media reports and live footage of interviews with scientists, activists, and locals. The film joins the erstwhile promise of nuclear energy, expressed during the plant's post-war construction, to the coming threat of a radiation-ruined environment, forming an explosive equation that opens critical rifts in the forsaken present. Resonating with the premise, in some ways, of The End of the World by the South Korean artists, the radiance evacuated Japanese villages and untouchable plant life within the contamination zone of Fukushima serve as an experimental laboratory in which elderly volunteers, called abandoned people by activists, expose themselves to what the Otolith Group terms the necropolitics of radiation, which suggests a governmentality of death administered by TEPCO, which is the Tokyo Electric Power Company responsible for Fukushima, the Fukushima plant, and Japan's political network, and more broadly the global nuclear regime for scientific research promoted by the International Atomic Energy Agency. So these elderly volunteers are people that continue to live in the Fukushima contamination zone, with the understanding that the radiation will take a few decades to affect them, and by that time they'll likely be dead from old age anyway. So they're effectively have volunteered themselves to be test subjects within the contamination zone. In the video, the abandoned landscape filled with toxic flowers is one populated by the walking dead, rendered ghosts in life before their time. Suffused with the creepy sounds of birds and insects heard in playgrounds and shopping streets normally filled with human activity, the imagery includes the representation of electric light, as if radiation normally invisible to human perception is made apparent thanks to the infrared camera. Here's some other stills. The infrared camera employed in the black and white segments of the video. It shows that appearance of radiation. And here's I'll play a clip of the piece. Photography, of course, constitutes a technique of observation that displaces the anthropocentrism of other models of picture making, such as drawing or painting, owing to the camera's de-hierarchizing of visuality, a result of its radical equalizing of the visual field of its focus, where sundry environmental objects can receive the same detail as a human face. The toxic zone of radiation pushes this de-anthropocentrism into the anti-human, captured imperfectly, but all the more truthfully, by our surrogate camera eye. As such, the post-human environment that we see here joins with video's suprahuman visuality in the radiant to confront the post-anthropocentric realizations of the speculative realist philosopher Ray Brassier, especially where he writes of a mind-independent reality which, despite the presumptions of human narcissism, is indifferent to our existence and oblivious to the values and meanings which we would drape over it in order to make it more hospitable, or in this case, less so. Brassier's book, Nihil Unbound, Enlightenment and Extinction, from 2007, attempts to comprehend the logical consequences of the Enlightenment's disenchantment of the world through reason, and refuses to defend against the threat of nihilism by safeguarding the experience of meaning. Rather than positioning nihilism as the heroic conquering of metaphysical thought, or as an act of empty negativity that represents what he calls a calamitous diminishment of the world's significance deprived of human values, Brassier turns it into what he calls a speculative opportunity. As such, his text and the Otolith Group's film broach the paradoxical implications of the so-called Anthropocene era, where human beings may come to be the central drivers of geological change, as well as the agents of their own extinction. So I think that that's really interesting in this film. Of course, the Anthropocene is this new scientific term that's been proposed to characterize our geological era. Anthropocene takes over the Holocene, and it's the era where humans become the drivers of geological changes. So it's interesting that that occurs at the same time where we can begin to envisage, owing to climate change and the disasters that are upon us, the extinction of human species. While primarily a philosophical text without ecological reference, Brassier's book Nihil Unbound, there can be no coincidence that the book comes to us in the context of what some scientists are referring to as the 6th mass species extinction event we're living through now. So sorry to get a little depressing here, but this is true, what's going on. Owing to a combination of climate change, environmental destruction, and the spread of humans worldwide, we could see, according to this view, we could see the die-off of roughly half the world's plants, animals, and birds in the next 70 years. Such an eventuality poses questions such as what a world would be like without its vibrant biodiversity. And ultimately, if that biodiversity is life-sustaining for us, what a world would be like without us. In addition to the Otolith Group's film, we have other glimpses of post-human environments in contemporary art, where photography and video, thanks to their time-traveling capacity, cross and blur temporalities, uncovering hidden pockets of futurity in the present. As such, they seize that speculative opportunity of which Brassier speaks. I'm thinking particularly of the image complex surrounding post-nuclear disaster zones, such as Chernobyl and Fukushima. To say nothing of the World War II bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Marshall Islands, where residents were studied by the U.S. military for the effects of radioactive fallout from nuclear tests between roughly 1946 and 1958. So that's in the Marshall Islands. Diana Thader's video installation, for example, Chernobyl from 2010, This is an installation shot of that multi-screen projection. Shows haunting images of Pripyat, a city built in the early 1970s for workers at the reactor in northwest Ukraine, now lying abandoned after that plant's meltdown in 1986. It presents contemporary ruins and an architecture of sudden abandonment, the aftermath of disaster, where nature and animals, genetically altered in unknown ways by radioactive exposure, reclaim formerly human spaces. And this Pripyat has become an area of tourism, interestingly, in the last few years. So people can go and see what, they can visit for a limited period of time that post-disaster environment. Thader's arena of video projection, a virtual theater of technological sensation, allegorizes a denaturalized nature emptied of human life. Or take Jane and Louise Wilson's The Toxic Camera from 2012, a video that investigates Soviet filmmaker Vladimir Shevchenko's recordings of Chernobyl in the last days after the accident, for which he produced footage marked by static interference from radiation rendered visible via the visual obfuscations in his imagery. His camera was so contaminated it had to be buried on the outskirts of Kiev after his visit. The work relates so this is a still from that film. The work relates the uninhabitable space of nuclear contamination to the to the failure of technologies of perception, a forlorn context which nonetheless can't suppress attempts at its visualization, even if that means tempting a contemporary death drive to know what the aftermath of human life looks like. The Radiant, in my view, goes still further than these examples, insofar as it entangles the future enchanted gardens of the post-human in the political conflicts of the present. As such, the film exemplifies what Frederick Jameson calls negative utopianism, one that, in his words, transforms our own present into the determinate past of something yet to come. Rather than giving itself over to the sci-fi seductions of some future biotechnology, this work finds the future imminent in specific conditions of our own present. The result is that this future projected by the Radiant works like a mechanism to make the present different than it appears, sparking, in the best case, a political energy to resist what is already occurring. In fact, the video also shows, in other scenes, protesters contesting Japan's irresponsible and media-spun response to the Fukushima disaster, especially the government's decision, in cahoots with the corporation TEPCO, to distribute irradiated soil throughout the country to shield itself against future liability lawsuits by destroying control groups of forensic samples and valuing, in other words, corporate profits over people by repeatedly raising the accepted risk levels of radiation exposure. So in other words, it's taken soil from Fukushima and distributed it across the country. And this is something that the people and the activists are calling them to account for. The Otolith Group thereby seizes the speculative opportunity of a post-extinction environment to contest such a necropolitical regime and to provide witness to a world haunting in its calm and peacefulness without us. As we've seen then, Documenta 13 and its conceptless exhibition tended more toward a dispersive bioaesthetics of sci-fi and even toward a neo-surrealist futurism. And especially I'm thinking of the works of Salvador Dali in the show, also Pierre Huyghe. As such, it missed the opportunity to engage the philosophical and political controversies surrounding the status of life today, let alone position itself within them. Still, I think it remains significant that the exhibition opened paths for artists to explore the biopolitics of nature, the mixed economies of food production and experimental gardens, and the contested modes of environmental governance, present and future. These questions lie at the heart of contemporary debates over what kind of world we want to live in, how it will be organized, and what role art might play in its creative imagination, representation, and realization. For with each passing day, the stakes of those debates only continue to grow more momentous. Thank you.
Not really take a particular position, but rather take a very pluralistic view. Do you feel that that is a weakness, or do you feel that the role of something like Documenta should be more to take a particular position? Just wondered.
I was criticizing it for its explicit, non-conceptual approach to the exhibition making. And that's Carolyn Christophe Boukardziev's decision to do that. And in some ways, I think it's an interesting approach and valid. Especially, I mean, I think she was motivated by a resistance to allowing works of art to be funneled into curatorial visions. So I think that that's an interesting approach, and that makes sense. Although it's not like that has to happen when you have a curatorial conceptualization for an exhibition. But I think it was a lost opportunity, especially when she's dealing with such sensitive and politically urgent subject matter, not to take more of a position curatorially in relationship to these questions. And Harraway and Shiva were also authors that were invited to a symposium that happened in September of 2012 on seeds. It was called On Seeds, and it's archived online so you can watch documentation of it. And it was moderated by And again, there was no cross-referencing or no attempt to mediate between the differences of the positions. And so it presented the positions, but absolutely failed to articulate or to acknowledge even this conflict between them. And so, I don't know, maybe this is too intellectual or too academic in some ways, but I think it really cuts to the politics of theory in a way that's important to acknowledge, to investigate and to grapple with. And that's what I'm trying to do. I don't know, maybe that's not the job of a curator or of that curator, but I think for me it was a missed opportunity that she didn't push that question more and position herself in relationship to it. Yeah.
To Green Fort, somebody you haven't talked about at all, would he be somebody who does come into the book, or that you would kind of put into some?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he'll come up in a different chapter, but I've been interested in his work for sure. And he participated in the exhibition, not as an artist, but as he organized one of the off-site locations that was dedicated to a Harraway archive, and showed different forms of companion species that she's also written about. So there was a video archive and a library in that small off-site location that he designed. So it wasn't an art project of his, but it was an interesting project. But his work more broadly, I think, is very interesting and deals with a lot of various ecological questions, especially in terms of the financialization of nature and the way materials and forms of life are commodified, like water, for example. Yeah.
Somebody of yourselves is the work she presented at Documenta in Otolith, the Brazilian art.
Yeah. That's another example. She dealt with the lake in Mexico City. There were many other examples that one could draw on, and I'll look at her as well in the book in a different.
You explicitly didn't want to go too much into Pierre Huyghe, for example, that kind of potentially dystopian post-ecological scenario that
Yeah.
Evoking or whatever?
Well, I feel like I had my hands full with what I did choose to deal with.
No,
that was
I'm
enough.
not kind of judging your
No, I know, yeah. No, but
wondering why at this point of the research.
yeah,
Explicitly to focus on some.
Yeah, I didn't like that work at all. It seemed just it seemed kind of silly to me, and I'm waiting to see. I'd like to read a good analysis of it that convinces me otherwise. But
So would you be arguing for an art practice more rooted in kind of activist grounds?
I would be more interested in that. Yeah. The Pure Week piece just it didn't reach me. It didn't articulate any positions. It seemed quite fanciful. It seemed like a type of neo-surrealist gesture. I saw the pink dog as well. It's just I don't know. Did you like that piece?
I just thought it was intriguing. Made me think of Fitzcarraldo.
Uh-huh.
I feel the same way.
The same way as me or her?
No, it's Sophie.
Okay.
I'm just pretending to be an activist right now. Let's say I'm an environmental activist. And listening to your talk right now and seeing what the artists have done with how they played with the medium of film and photography, for example, with the infrared and also the Anthropocene.
Yeah, Anthropocene or
Yes.
yeah.
If I were an activist and my role is to make adverts for to push my cause, then I would use the format of not of the Otolith project and the other one. Sorry, the photography with the Anthropocene station. So it's something like it's the thing with artists with social reality and fiction, and it's either you get the style and apply it to design and makes it practical. So it's a failure of some artists in some aspects, but if you see success at one point, then it's what activists can learn from artists.
But I think this is the question, isn't it? Are we looking at these practices as art or as activism? And I think maybe this is some of what's difficult. But if you look at it, it's almost like it's a commentary on growing chard rather than actually growing chard, or it's a commentary on kind of future gardens rather than actual prototypes for future gardens. And that's where it gets a bit confusing. Are we supposed to look at these as, just artistic projects which may fail, or actually as a form of activism, in which case, if they fail, then they've completely failed?
I think the critique should be really aimed more at the professions and the industries which grow things, and design professions which take gardening and landscape architecture and do nothing political with them, which are completely constrained by economics and business interests and playing it safe and don't do anything. And that's why I think if artists do it, they at least have the freedom to say things about how they're growing the vegetables, or I think that's why they do it. Other people can't do it.
And it's a different framework. So you see it differently because it's presented in a particular context. So you're not looking, well, I'm not particularly looking for it to be fantastically grown chard or a choice of 10 different things I might want to get at the kiosk. It's a very different way of looking at it. It's not a pragmatic activist agenda. It's bringing to it, I'm not sure I can actually articulate what, but it's the whole reference of an art context, which is something completely different. But that relationship between activism and art has always been an extremely difficult one to negotiate.
Yeah, and I would add to the conversation. I think that's quite complex question, the relationship between art and activism, and it differs in various contexts. So, I think the Christian Philip Mueller example, a question, if we have more time to analyze this, would be something like, what does he bring? What are the advantages of bringing the growing of Swiss chard to an art exhibition and placing it within the category of art? What is he bringing to our understanding that justifies that, or is it really just a case of looking at a garden? In which case, why do it in the context of Documenta 13? I think Claire Pentecost is very different, where she really does imagine herself as an activist, and she's attempting to invent design protocols for urban contexts that are land poor areas, so that the vertical garden are really for those areas that she intends to be implemented, to be realized within various precarious communities that don't have access to gardening. So hers is really an activist position that is opportunistically situated within an art context. So
there are all lines of vertical gardens. Like, activists have been thought about that for decades. So it's like really pathetic activism. Sorry. And it goes back to what the lady at the back was saying. It's different. They're not necessarily positioning themselves as activists, but I think when they are positioning themselves as activists, then if that's the thing, that is their intention. Then in a sense you're asking to be judged on, in terms of how successful your ideas are, in terms of bringing about the things that you believe in, or the things that you think should be happening, rather than as art objects. If that's how you're presenting yourself.
I disagree with you, Anna, because I feel like when you're an artist of a particular caliber, your exhibition opportunity is a platform, and you can choose to do that, to showcase in that whatever it is you want to showcase. So if I am an activist and an artist, and I do also activist work, and I want to use this platform to show activist work, and if we can think about a very different context, we can think of the context of the Middle East politically, and think of a whole swath of examples where that has occurred, where artists have used the public platform to kind of present their activist work as opposed to their art practice. I think that's also a viable rationale or project, in the sense that you're doing that. So I don't think, and also it's just interesting to bring in these discourses into different fields, and I feel like, yes, people may have been doing it in these different contexts, but if not everyone knows about them, then what's the problem with giving it a different platform? I'm just I think it's a no-brainer really that everyone approaches every field a different kind of sphere to talk about these issues. And it's also just interesting because art is a cross-disciplinary field as well, where you can start off with something and take it elsewhere. So I'm again just playing devil's advocate to you.
I didn't go to Documenta, and I didn't know very much about it, so comes with that ignorance behind it. But it seems to me that in a way one of the strongest things that you were saying was expressing was your disappointment in terms of bringing some of these things together to be challenging from one to another. And I'm intrigued about the inclusion of something like Vandana Shiva in it, because as far as I'm aware, she wouldn't conceive of herself as an artist.
No, not at all, not at all.
So that seems to me to go against, I haven't got the name of the overall curator, but her ostensibly saying, this is without concept, but then to draw in and include somebody like that is a very particular choice. So there seems to me to be a contradiction there in itself, in terms of her saying, her curating outlook. But also, I totally agree with you. What a lost opportunity, really, to sort of bring these different things to more of a sort of head-to-head sort of clash, because there is real interest in that, and I think the conversation that we're sort of having now is about, well, how do you make these different strands relevant one to another? And I think surely, from what I can see, the Otolith Group's Radiant film, it looks amazing actually, but that is highly political, and we live in a political world, with really big issues. So, I kind of feel that it's not only a lost opportunity, but it's, without wanting to become a kind of boring Puritan, actually, it's kind of irresponsible, actually. not to sort of draw these things out more clearly.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's just not a lost opportunity. I mean, I think we have to take responsibility to extrapolate from what is produced and exactly what TJ is doing. For a lot of us who went to Documenta, I mean, I really welcome what you're bringing together in a way that I didn't see it like that. But I saw it maybe made different connections and so on. So I think that, I don't know, this sort of seems to be a strain of kind of like it's up to you artists to kind of do everything. I think it's a conversation with all of us, and it's often it's a starting point, and I'm sure it's generated a good discussion actually already. So.
Yeah. Well, I want to credit the exhibition with doing that. I mean, for sure. I mean, it did raise a lot of important issues, even if it wasn't really directed with a curatorial vision.
But I kind of felt like to say that she was having no curatorial input really wasn't what she was saying either. I mean, I can't recall because it was some time ago that I read whatever she had written, but I thought it was more that she was having a kind of very open and all-encompassing approach, which is why, like she's including people who wouldn't normally be considered artists, or because there was a lot of very political works there, and not just related to kind of eco-politics or bioaesthetics. So
for sure.
I think it was more that she's, I mean, I guess perhaps in a way that is kind of her curatorial input, is she's putting all these things there to be considered, but refraining from commenting on them or deliberately kind of setting up binaries between things.
Yeah.
I'm interested in hearing that you have an example of an exhibition that you think did take, a more interesting stance on environmental issues. Like, I read the third text, and for example, the Sharjah Biennial or other exhibitions that have been curated. Do you have like an example of an exhibition that you think might have been a little bit more articulate on these issues? No.
Not the Sharjah Biennial. There's been a variety of different exhibitions that touch on ecology, especially in the last 10 or 15 or so years. And I've written about some of them in the exhibition that was at the Barbican a few years ago at Radical Nature, which was itself an interesting prospect, but ultimately very disappointing as an exhibition for a variety of reasons. But I wrote a text for that catalog where I looked at different exhibitions, and certainly there have been a lot of interesting projects. So one was was called Beyond Green at the Smart Museum in Chicago. I think that was a very smart and interesting exhibition that dealt with these issues and tried to integrate ecological questions into the very making of the exhibition, and included artists like Nils Norman, for example. But I think really in general, the exhibitions dedicated to ecology are, I think, really often disappointing for one reason or another. So maybe that's just not the place to look for cutting-edge approaches to art and ecology. Maybe I posed this question in that Radical Nature text. Maybe the exhibition as an apparatus is simply not a sustainable format, unless it's really radically reinvented. So that's a question I'm thinking about and attempting to answer. I think the art world's or much of the art world's relation to a global model of transportation and mobility is ultimately very problematic and unsustainable. So what are the ramifications of a realization like that?
I think that's a provocative note to end on. That's all we have time for now, but I'd really like us all to thank TJ for his time and all of you for your
Yeah, thank you.